Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Verdun for PC, Mac, Linux, and PS4, although I do believe there's an Xbox One version on the way as well. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by M2H Game Studio and Blackmill Games. It was originally released in early access in 2013 and finally saw its full release last year. And as I'm recording this, a few days ago, it was actually released on PlayStation 4 on August 30th of this year. And it's interesting because it's a World War I first-person shooter. We almost never get any of those. I mean, there's this and there's Battlefield 1, and I can't think of any others off the top of my head anyway. And unlike Battlefield 1, which is trying to go for the rule of cool, in this particular case, they're going more for historical authenticity and accuracy than anything else. The question there, of course, becomes, how does that actually influence the game in the long run? Does the emphasis on a more realistic approach make it a more compelling game, or is it something else entirely? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, the word I would use to describe the graphics is ugly, and this is both an intentional choice of the art design as well as the byproduct of the actual visual quality. I mean, you can tell just from the video footage that this thing looks several years older than it actually is, and it ends up looking very outdated as a result. Texture quality isn't particularly good, the modeling quality is decent enough, but there's a few oddities here and there. Animations in particular look pretty bad, honestly. Especially the first-person animations when you're, for example, reloading, which are ridiculously sluggish for some baffling reason. And then, of course, there's the aesthetic choices that they made that make it look pretty awful, namely the point réaliste that they've decided to do, which is admittedly very accurate for World War I. It was a lot of trench warfare, there was a lot of mud everywhere, and there really wasn't much color in World War I. But it is rough on the eyes, and actually it makes it really hard to distinguish the enemies from the environment a lot of the time, because they blend in very well. And while it is certainly, again, accurate, it's also a problem because it means that it's kind of a pain to actually be able to find anything in the environment to shoot at. In fact, about the only thing that they did pretty well in terms of visuals is the gore effects, which are suitably gruesome and fit in well with World War I, particularly when they are coupled with the sound effects, particularly the voice acting, because when somebody gets shot or blown to hell by artillery or grenades in this thing, they start screaming like a maniac, and a lot of the time they'll even be writhing around on the ground in pain, so it's definitely suitably gruesome for World War I, but at the same time, you have to actually turn that on. The gore is disabled by default for some baffling reason. And of course, once you get past that, there's really not much to the visuals, and you move over into the sound design to find that it's a very, very weak game in the sound department. The voice acting is tolerable, but very noticeably amateurish. While the Americans, the Brits, and the Canadians all speak English, everyone else does speak their native language. So the French speak French, Germans speak German, and Belgians speak, as far as I can tell, the Belgian dialect of French. But then again, je ne parle pas français, so there's only so much I can do with that. And once you get past that, things just tend to get worse and worse. The music is generally pretty weak. It does have period-accurate music in the menu, but when you get to the actual in-game music, when you're in the middle of a fight, it's way too upbeat for what's going on. I mean, World War I was a horrible meat grinder, and Verdun is no exception here either, and yet you've got some surprisingly upbeat music that plays at the end of a match. It ends up not making very much sense at all, and what ends up happening is it becomes a godsend that it only happens at the beginning and end of a match, because during the middle of the match you've got absolutely no music playing at all, and you can just focus on the actual sounds of the carnage around you. The problem there, of course, being that this really doesn't have very good sound effects in general. The explosions are nowhere near beefy enough, weapons fire sounds downright pathetic half the time, and hell, some of the sound effects even seem like they came straight out of a generic sound library. It is extremely disappointing in that regard, and what you end up with is sound design that overall is just rather weak. But of course what really matters here is the gameplay, because there is no campaign, there is no story to speak of here. So what you're left with is one of 4 game modes, and you're playing as either the Central Powers or the Entente. Although in this case, when they say Central Powers, what they really mean is Germany, because they actually don't have any other units than German units in the game right now. Similarly, they're pretty selective on which of the Entente powers actually get included, because you end up with the Brits, the Americans, the French, the Belgians, and the Canadians. And the thing is that when you're picking which particular power you're playing as, you're actually picking which squad to be a part of. And as of right now, there are currently 12 squads, and of those, 7 of them are Entente powers. So the Central powers only get 5 squad types available, and they're all German units. Now, each squad has its own specific abilities as well as its own specific weaponry. And to give you an example here, I'm going to talk about the Lancers, which are the fairly standard German infantry. You have your Unteroffizier, which is your basic officer class. They have a pistol, and then they can actually call in artillery support. You have the Schütze, which is your basic rifleman, really. The MG Schütze, which is your basic machine gunner class, and then you have a grenadier class available as well. Now, as you play with your squad will actually level up as well, and it will give you access to a variety of passive bonuses. Things like being able to hold your breath longer while trying to aim at a target, or being able to reload faster. All sorts of these different abilities that will increase your combat effectiveness, or at least that's the idea. I honestly didn't notice much of a difference depending on which class I was playing, simply because it didn't really matter as much as you might think it would. What's really going to matter there are your weapons, because the iron sights in this game are absolutely terrible. They are tiny and hard to see, and while you may seem to think that's a gameplay problem, it's actually an authenticity problem, because iron sights of that period were pretty terrible as well. People really don't realize this, but World War II was about the first time where pretty much everybody was fielding rifles that didn't have terrible iron sights. In World War I, about the best you got was the Enfield rifle that the Brits shared with the US. It was the M1917 in the US, and that thing has iron sights fairly comparable to an M1 Garand, if you're familiar with that. Meanwhile, everyone else was having to deal with blocky sights that were hard to get any real pinpoint accuracy out of, and that is definitely represented in this game. It is legitimately difficult to use those sights. And even if you get the hang of using the sights themselves, you still have to adjust to the actual bullet physics, so you need to pay attention to moving targets and make sure you're leading them appropriately, and you need to actually adjust your aim for particularly long-range shots as well. So there is some degree of skill involved at picking off targets at longer ranges and even moving targets at closer ranges. But when you get into the close range of the trenches, things get a lot messier, and it really ends up being a matter of whoever has either a submachine gun, a shotgun, or a pistol. Because if you're using a rifle in those situations, then chances are you're probably going to get mowed down before you have a chance to do much of anything. And again, that's period accurate. It's also period accurate to get picked off from a long way away without having any idea where that shot came from. The problem with that is that this is a video game, and while a degree of that is perfectly fine, it gets incredibly frustrating to be picked off from a long range without having any idea where the guy was, just because they blend in so well with the environment. If it were once in a while, then it wouldn't be as frustrating, but it's almost every single death that you experience in this thing. Now, this is mitigated somewhat when you get a large coordinated infantry attack going, or if you manage to get your NCO to call in an artillery barrage on just the right spot, because if the artillery barrage comes in, then the enemy's either going to have to keep their head down, or they're just going to get blown to hell. Or if you're doing a massed infantry attack, then they have a harder time actually dealing with that unless they have machine guns, in which case it's stupidly easy to take you all down. This points out that the game itself centers very heavily on teamwork, and if you're not working well together as a team, then you're not going to be having a good time, because you're just going to get stomped on. That's at least if you're playing the main mode of the game, which is Frontlines. The idea there is that you have a team trying to attack a point and a team trying to defend that point. And the way this works is that it's a back and forth, because you have the attacking team trying to take over that point, and if they take that point over, then the opposing team can actually counterattack and try to take the point back. If they succeed at this, then the enemy gets pushed back, and they have to recapture that point again. If the enemy manages to hold the point instead of just capitulating to the originally defending team, then they actually get to move on to the next point, and that defending team gets moved back to that point to defend it as well. Eventually the defending team will get pushed back to their final point on the map and have to defend that, and if they lose that point, then they lose the match. Thing is that usually the matches are over before that happens, because the time will actually run out before you manage to capture those points. That constant sense of going forward and then having to retreat is something that is very emblematic of how World War I actually was, where someone would capture a trench and then that enemy force would take that trench back and they would be pushed back to their old trench and vice versa until eventually they just kind of give up on it altogether. Thing is, in terms of gameplay mechanics, it ends up becoming fairly stale fairly quickly, and so you might want to try one of the other modes to see if you can shake things up before going back into the Frontlines mode. Now, the other modes that are available are Attrition, which is a full weapon team deathmatch where anyone can pick whatever weapons they want. They can pick a primary and a secondary, and they have to unlock these with career points. Now, these are something that you just earn by playing the game and gradually ranking up over time, and you use those to unlock different loadouts in the Frontlines mode, as well as different weapons in the Attrition mode, and so on. But other than that unlock system, the Attrition mode is just a basic team deathmatch. You're competing for the highest number of kills at the end of the match. And then, of course, there's Rifle Deathmatch, which is exactly as it sounds. You're fighting it out with other people with just rifles and not much else. And then there's Squad Defense, which is you and your squad up against waves of enemies. And the AI on those enemies is incredibly stupid. I mean, it's basically like shooting fish in a barrel when you really get down to it. The only reason they really pose a threat is sheer numbers. Eventually you just run out of ammo, or you'll just empty your magazine and then you're going to be stuck meleeing things because you only get your one weapon unless you're certain classes, so you don't have a backup to switch to immediately. But it's still just a fairly basic wave defense mode, and there's not really much to speak of there. So the real meat of the game is in the Frontlines mode, and it's really just not very good when you get down to it. When it's not frustrating, it's just kind of boring. It doesn't have the intensity and the squad tactics of something like, say, Red Orchestra or Red Orchestra 2. Barely anyone communicates in this thing at all, and it just ends up being a complete mess as a result. The unlock system doesn't really do anything for the game. In fact, it's actually kind of annoying to deal with just because of the way they've set it up, where if you have to upgrade to a certain thing in your classes, then you have to purchase the previous tier of that class before you move on to the next one. So if you really want a particular rifle and it's in tier 3, well, you have to get tier 2 first, and it costs the same amount of points. It's just that it's kind of annoying to have to do that on every single class that you got. The classes themselves are just dependent on which squad you're in, and every single squad has different classes with different abilities, so it takes you quite a while to get used to all of those, and even then, you barely feel like any of them play differently from one another. About the only major differences are some of them have grenades to throw at things, some of them have machine guns or submachine guns, and some of them have shotguns, and then pretty much everybody else is just running around with a bolt-action rifle, some of which get scopes. But they're really not very good scopes. They have a tiny field of view, and it makes it pretty hard to actually aim and hit stuff with them. And you can never really shake the feeling throughout playing this that it never really left early access, even though it officially left early access in April of last year. There's numerous glitches all over the place, namely with regards to the ragdolls, which will just glitch out constantly, and there's plenty of instances where something just feels like it's undercooked, like it's just not quite ready yet, and the weapon handling itself feels clumsy, amateurish, and frankly just kind of unfinished in general. The whole thing ends up coming across as a fairly amateur production at best, and when you look at it in that light, even then it's still really not all that great. And when you combine all of that with the very low player base at this point, and it seems to be dwindling by the day, you end up with a game that is almost impossible to recommend, especially not at full price. If you can get it for cheap, then maybe, but it's gonna be really hit or miss for you depending on whether or not you can put up with the massive amount of faults the game has. But overall, it's a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.